So I'd like to talk about the idea of heroism, which is a word that has a lot of different stereotypical connotations. You know, who is a hero means different things to different people. I want to develop one particular kind of idea of being heroic, which is really that we motivate ourselves with, with a real passion to excel, with real ambition, and with goals that are bigger than any one person's ego. That last part is, in many ways, the most important part. That we aim for goals that are bigger than ourselves, and that's where I want to spend a little bit of time. There's this anecdote about from the 1960s about the space program in the United States, and the story goes that President Kennedy at a certain point is having a tour around the space agency, and at a certain point he runs into a janitor who's cleaning up an office, and I guess to be polite and to help the guy be relaxed, he says, "So what's your job here?" And the guy says to him, "Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon." All right, this is very romantic. I mean, this is not how I've ever felt about my life, but it sort of illustrates the point. You know, this idea that whatever somebody's role is in an organization, that they appreciate themselves as somehow being connected to something bigger. I read an interview once with Alan Mulally, the guy who's now running Ford, who ran Boeing for a long time. And I just want to quote how he talks about what he understood his role to be. "I realized very early on that what I was really being asked to do was to help connect a set of talented people to a bigger goal, a bigger program, and help them move forward to even bigger contributions. And so the higher the calling, the higher the compelling vision you can articulate, the more it pulls everybody in." So this, this is a guy who is really running manufacturing companies, and he's talking about, what he sees his job as, completely in spiritual terms, this sense of calling and higher vision and all this kind of stuff. And, I think a lot of times people throw out vision, and it just has this nonsensical, unrealistic feel, or we feel like they don't actually believe what they're trying to get us to swallow. I'm not commenting on the person I just quoted, but in general, people who work in companies, we sort of have this idea of a disconnect between what's said and what's actually going on. And this is a kind of a crisis, I think, in organizational life, and I want to develop that crisis a little bit. So, first, the first thing is that, we know from our own anecdotal experience that the teams that perform best, whether it's my old J.P. Morgan or the Jesuits or whatever family you belong to or whatever organization you're in, are organizations where people get over themselves and appreciate it's not all about them. A university, for example, is a huge place. There are hundreds of different roles that individuals perform in universities, and universities stink if people feel like it's all about them. It's all about accounting, or it's all about this library, it's all about my job, or whatever it may be. And organizations, universities do well if people feel that they're somehow investing in an overall mission, an overall project, an overall sense of why we're here that's bigger. They see their contribution as plugging into something bigger. And the research really validates that anecdotal idea that we all have. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this interesting work done by John Kotter that was published, a guy from Harvard Business School, that was published as Corporate Culture and Performance. And as I recall it, they did this interesting experiment where they did interviews at a number of companies that had performed very well financially over a number of years, and then at a set of companies that had poor financial results over time. And they're trying to understand, are there cultural things that also help to explain why some companies perform well and others poorly? And one of the interesting findings they come up with is that in lousy companies, people tend to be thinking about themselves. When I'm doing business in a transaction, what I'm concerned with is not giving this guy a great product, but how much money can I make on this transaction, Or in terms of the people who work for me, what I'm thinking about is these people are like my tools. That's not the way I say it, but that's the way I think about it, and I'm kind of using people in order to get myself ahead in the company and to look good. And what they find in very strong performing companies is exactly the opposite kind of mentality tends to prevail, that people habitually tend to be thinking about others in these kind of senses, for example, that look, this is not my company, this is a shareholder's company. And so we owe the shareholders a return on their investment. That's one way I think. Or, I have a set of customers, I have clients, and the way I'm thinking is, okay, look, we have to give these people a terrific product that really suits their needs and makes them happy. And in terms of people who work for me, they're not like tools. Rather, my mindset is to think, well, how can I develop these people and help them be as strong performing as possible so that they can develop their talents and move along in their career. And by the way, that's also going to help our company to perform best when everybody performs optimally. But I think the crisis, the challenge that we really have not come to grips with a lot is that this way of thinking is deeply challenged in culture in a lot of our organizations. For example, we have companies where people can make, as in the industry that I worked in, investment banking, incredible amounts of money. And when you see that you personally can enjoy such extraordinary rewards, it can be very difficult sometimes to put your own ego and self-interest on the shelf and to invest sufficiently in the organizational performance. Or, we get companies where tenure is very challenged. In other words, where there are frequently downsizings, layoffs. We're in very volatile economies. These are just facts of life. I'm not suggesting we can or ought to change those. But there again, we end up with very strong impetus to worry about myself first and only myself, because I could lose my job at any time. And so I tend to think about the people around me as competitors. And so to get over those kinds of ways of thinking are difficult human tasks that I think require a deep level of investment in belief that actually we're not here anyway for ourselves. People bring this kind of spirit to their work, and that's what enables them to get over very strong me-first sort of thinking. So organizations perform well if they're filled with heroic kinds of people at all levels. In other words, people who care about being excellent, doing the best they can, people who are ambitious in the proper sense of that word. They want to aim for very ambitious goals, and that they aim for goals that are bigger than themselves. They feel themselves invested in some bigger project. And bosses are heroic if they're able to help create this kind of environment. If they themselves care about things that are bigger themselves, and they help to other people to start to feel that way about their own work.